Okay, so you know how everything's been so politically charged lately, right? Like every time you turn on the news, it's just another back and forth.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And this whole debate about Muslim reservations, well, that's definitely been front and center, hasn't it? Especially with what's been happening in Karnataka between the BJP and the Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been hard to miss.
It seems like just yesterday we're hearing about Deputy Chief Minister Shivakumar, and then bam, BJP President Nada comes out swinging about that 4% reservation for Muslims in public contracts.
It's a lot to keep up with.
It really is. And I think for a lot of people trying to follow along, it can feel kind of like, well, a little overwhelming.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the details.
Right. And that's exactly why we wanted to take a deep dive into this topic today.
Definitely, because if you look past all the immediate, the political noise and all that, there's actually a much deeper and honestly a much older story here.
Exactly. And the really important thing to understand right off the bat is this idea of Muslim communities having access to reservations in India. It's not something that just came out of nowhere.
Right, it's not some brand new policy.
It has a history, and it's not just about someone's religion either.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
A lot of Muslim communities have been recognized as part of the other backward classes, the OBCs, for a long time now, both at the national level and in different states.
And there are very real reasons for that.
Absolutely. These communities were included in the OBC category because they faced and still face some serious historical disadvantages.
Things like poverty and lack of education and just systemic marginalization that goes way back.
It's really about trying to address these inequalities that have existed for so long.
Absolutely.
Right.
I think what's fascinating and really changes how we see this whole debate is how far back this recognition of Muslim communities as backward actually goes.
Oh, yeah, like it's not a recent thing at all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Take Karnataka, for example. They actually identified Muslims as a backward community way back in 1921.
Wow, 1921. That's over a century ago.
Exactly. It completely challenges this idea that it's some kind of new political strategy.
It's a whole different way of looking at things.
It really is. So what we're going to do today is unpack all of this. We're going to go deep into the reasons for these reservations, look at the constitutional and legal side of things.
And we'll see how different states have actually put this into practice.
Sounds good to me. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it. So one of the things that keeps coming up in this whole debate is this idea of a religious quota.
Yeah, you hear that phrase thrown around a lot.
And I think we need to address that head on because it seems to be causing a lot of confusion.
Definitely. And from what I've read, constitutional law expert Professor G. Mohan Gopal has a really interesting take on this.
Oh, yeah. What's his perspective?
Well, he basically argues that a lot of the controversy is unnecessary, and it's based on a misunderstanding of how these reservations actually work.
So he's saying it's not really about religion at all?
Exactly. He's saying the key factor is socio-economic backwardness. It's about addressing real disadvantages, not about favoring one religion over another.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's take Karnataka as an example. What happened there specifically?
So back in 1995, the Karnataka government decided to set aside a 4% quota for Muslim OBCs.
4%. Okay.
Right? And this was within the larger 32% OBC category. So it wasn't like they were creating a whole separate category just for Muslims.
Right. It was part of the existing OBC framework.
Exactly. And this decision was based on evidence that showed these communities were actually backward. They presented data, and the Supreme Court has always maintained that this kind of measurable backwardness is the crucial justification for reservations.
So it wasn't arbitrary. It was based on real data.
Precisely. Now, fast forward to 2023. The BJP government, under Basavaraj Bommai, decided to do away with that 4% Muslim quota.
They got rid of it, just like that.
Well, they tried to. Their plan was to redistribute it to other communities like the Vaikaligas and the Lingayats, but the Supreme Court wasn't too happy about it.
They weren't.
Not at all. They actually called the decision prima facie flawed and shaky. And prima facie basically means on the surface of it. So the Supreme Court saw some serious problems with the decision right from the get-go.
Wow. That's a pretty strong language.
It is. It suggests they had major concerns about the reasoning behind the cancellation and whether it was even done properly.
So then what happened?
Well, that kind of paved the way for the Congress after they won the state elections. They promised to bring back the 4% quota, and they did.
So it's been quite a back and forth in Karnataka.
It really has. And it all boils down to this fundamental question of who qualifies for reservations and why.
And to really understand that, we need to look at the Constitution, right? What does it actually say about all of this?
You're absolutely right. When the Constitution was being drafted, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was one of the key figures involved, he made it very clear that defining backward classes is ultimately a policy decision for the government to make.
So it's not set in stone in the Constitution itself.
Exactly. It needs to be flexible enough to adapt to the changing social realities of the country.
That makes sense. And then there's that landmark Supreme Court judgment in the Indrasani case.
Oh, yes. That was a game changer in 1992.
What did that case clarify?
It clarified what constitutes a class
Mm.
for the purpose of reservations. They said you can't define a class solely on the basis of religion or caste.
So it's not just about those categories.
No. They said you have to consider a whole range of factors, socio-economic indicators, educational indicators, even political indicators. They suggested looking at something like 20 different criteria.
Wow, so it's a much broader assessment.
It is. It's about looking at the whole picture of disadvantage, not just one narrow aspect.
And for anyone listening who might think that the Constitution somehow prohibits reservations for Muslims specifically,
Yeah, there's often that misconception.
it's worth taking a look at Article 16.4.
That's the key article here. It says that the state can provide reservations for any backward class of citizens, which, in the opinion of the state, is not adequately represented in government services.
And what's interesting is that it doesn't mention religion at all.
Exactly. The focus is entirely on backwardness and representation. So the Constitution doesn't exclude any religious community from being considered for reservations.
So it really comes down to whether a particular group meets the criteria for backwardness.
Precisely. And it's fascinating to see how different states have approached this.
Oh, yeah. Karnataka isn't the only one dealing with this.
Not at all. Let's look at some other southern states, for example. Kerala. They've actually been doing this for a long time. Their history with Muslim reservations goes all the way back to 1936.
Wow, that's even earlier than Karnataka.
It is. And currently they have an 8% reservation for Muslims in educational institutions and a 10% reservation in government jobs. And this is all within their overall 30% OBC quota.
So it's integrated into their existing system.
Exactly. Then you have Tamil Nadu. They have a slightly different approach. They have a 30% OBC quota, and within that, they have a 3.5% subquota specifically for Muslims.
So again, it's about recognizing backwardness within a particular community.
Precisely. Now, Andhra Pradesh has had a bit of a roller coaster ride with this.
Oh, how so?
Well, in 2004, they tried to implement a 5% reservation for Muslims based on a report that showed their social and educational backwardness.
Okay, and what happened?
The High Court actually struck it down, but not because they objected to Muslim reservations in principle.
It wasn't about that?
No, it was about the way they'd gone about it. They found some procedural irregularities in how the reservation was implemented.
Ah, so it was a technicality.
Exactly. Later on, they introduced a 4% quota for specific Muslim groups. But even that faced legal challenges. It shows you how important the process and the evidence are in all of this.
You really have to do it the right way.
You do.
Yeah.
And then there's Bihar. They have a unique system. They categorize Muslims under the most backward classes, or MBCs.
MBCs.
Right. And the MBC category is often considered even more disadvantaged than the general OBC category. They have an 18% reservation for MBCs, then a separate 12% for other OBCs, and even a 3% reservation just for OBC women. So they're really trying to address different levels of backwardness within their population.
So it seems like even though the specific numbers and categories vary from state to state,
Yeah, there's definitely some variation.
the underlying principle is the same. It's about identifying and addressing socio-economic backwardness.
Exactly. And as Professor Mohan Gopal puts it, reservation is about backwardness, not about picking and choosing religious groups.
Right. It's about addressing real disadvantages wherever they exist.
And there's a whole process for determining that. The Backward Classes Commission collects data, they analyze it, they submit reports, and then the government makes a decision based on all that.
So it's not just a random decision. It's based on evidence.
Precisely. But as we've seen, especially during elections, the political rhetoric often simplifies things and sometimes even distorts the facts.
Oh, yeah, it can get really messy.
It can. And people start throwing around terms like religious quota without really understanding what that means or the historical context behind it.
So when we look at the current debates and all the back and forth in the news,
Yeah. What do you make of it all?
it makes me wonder what the real objections are. Are people genuinely opposed to the concept of reservation itself?
Or are they more concerned about which specific communities are seen as deserving of those reservations?
Because when you consider the historical context and the legal framework, it seems like the debate is often framed in a way that misses the bigger picture.
That's a great point. It's not just about religion. It's about addressing historical disadvantages and ensuring fair representation for those who have been marginalized.
And that brings up an important question for our listeners.
What?
What assumptions are driving these debates? Are we really focused on addressing inequalities, or is there something else going on?
It's something worth thinking about. So just to recap what we've talked about today, Muslim reservations in India are often part of larger OBC categories. They're not based on religion alone. They're based on assessments of socio-economic backwardness.
And there's a long history behind this. It's not a new phenomenon.
Exactly. And the Constitution and the legal framework for reservations are all about addressing underrepresentation and ensuring that backward classes have a fair chance.
Not about favoring one religion over another.
That's right. So as you continue to follow these discussions, keep this in mind. How is our understanding of backwardness itself evolving?
It's not a static concept.
Exactly. How does data and evidence intersect with the political narratives around social justice and representation?
It's complex.
It is. And to really understand it, you have to look beyond the headlines. You have to look at the criteria being used, the historical context, and the real lived experiences of these communities.
It's about digging deeper and getting the full story.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive today. It's been a really insightful conversation.
I agree. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, keep asking those tough questions and keep learning.
That's how we make progress.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.